Let's fly through this DNA, shall we? Unless you want me to pull a Lally, but I don't think you do. Sergeant Brian Gallerani got on the stand. He's from Needham Police Department on January 16th, 2024. He took swabs from Buchanan and Proctor. And oh, guess what? He followed procedure. And the defense had no cross-exam. I think the lack of cross-exam has an impact too. There's already a contrast between the witnesses seen in respect to DNA and all the other witnesses we've seen. And the lack of cross adds to the contrast. Nicholas Bradford, a DNA analyst, testified. And oh, guess what? There are chain of custody procedures that actually make sense. Oh, and they were followed. He was given hair, so the hair from the SUV, an extract from the taillight. And what that means is they swabbed the taillight and extracted DNA from whatever they picked up. And I need to make sure that everybody understands that DNA is not the same as blood. DNA is in blood, but DNA can be found outside of the presence of blood. I think most people know that, but I just wanted to make that clear. He also had the DNA from the two troopers, and he had John's DNA to compare. On the taillight, they found the DNA of 3 individuals. The DNA found on the taillight was compared to Trooper Buchanan, and it was not a match, which was expected. Compared to Trooper Proctor, not a match. And I expected that too. One of the contributors of the DNA on the taillight was John O'Keefe's. But again, that's no surprise. You would expect his DNA to be on there. There was the DNA of 3 individuals on that taillight, and only one of the 3 was identified. But that DNA could be anybody who touched that light. They tested the hair and they had to dissolve it. And even then, what they found was below the limit of detection. So they couldn't do nuclear DNA. And this witness was unable to determine who the hair belonged to, but that's going to come up again. And then he said there was no root, but I really thought the woman from the lab said there was a root. But then again, identifying whether or not there was a root was exactly what she failed on her proficiency. So I don't know. What they had left was sent for mitochondrial testing. That was the end of his testimony. The defense had no questions. The next witness was Tess Chart. There were no issues with the chain of custody. On January and March 2024, the DA's office submitted hair for her to test. The results were, in plain language, that the hair is a match for John. And so what? Let's say that nobody placed that hair on that vertical position on the SUV. Let's say there was no monkeying around with that. If that hair survived over 60 miles in a blizzard, who knows how long it could have been there before that. If it can hang on through a blizzard, could have been there for a month. And nobody can say that it wasn't there earlier in the day. So it doesn't mean a lot unless it was placed there. But then what that means is something different than what the prosecution wants it to mean. And that was the end of her testimony. I think on at least some of these items, the defense and the prosecution could have agreed to some things. And so Lally wouldn't have had to go through the big long song and dance. But I think it was good that he had to, because he had to cover off things like chain of custody. Then the jury has to see that so that they can see that contrast. The defense had no questions for cross-exam. The next witness was Andre Porto, and he works at the state lab. He's a forensic scientist. He works in DNA. He tested swabs from the passenger side taillight. I note this is not blood. He found one of the contributors matched with John O'Keefe, which we've already heard, and that's to be expected. And again, we heard there were 2 unknown contributors on the taillight, and they remain unknown, but they could come from anyone. It doesn't mean much. In respect to the hair, he did examine the hair. There wasn't enough DNA detected, so they were unable to do any further testing on it. He tested the glass on the bumper. There was DNA on it, but the amount was insufficient to be able to test it, so no further testing was done. The broken glass found beneath John O'Keefe, of course, one of the DNA contributors on that glass matched with John. It would be really weird if it didn't. But there were 2 other contributors of DNA on that glass, and we don't know who they were. They tested from a swab from a stain on John's jeans, the upper right leg, and the stain they tested showed 3 contributors. 1 was O'Keefe. And Lally asked about transfer DNA and the degradation of DNA. And the witness said things like heat, sun, time. And Lally jumped on that and said, "Oh, you said heat. What about if it's found in a very cold place? What if the temperature is very cold?" And the witness said, "That's how we store our DNA. It's cold." But what Lally didn't ask about is some of the other factors that can degrade DNA are things like moisture or chemical. So it's not like the list was exhaustive. Stain B, upper right leg on the jeans, matched with John's. Stain C, upper right leg of the jeans, matched with John's, but there were also 2 other contributors. If there was DNA on his jeans or his shirt from other people, and that DNA was in an unstained area, then that's easily explained away. He was in the bars. He was mingling around. So he would be in contact with people. There's lots of transfer of DNA going on in those places. But that they found it on the stained area suggests something different. And I don't have the expertise to really go into detail about that aspect of it. Stain D, upper right jeans, 3 contributors. 1 was John. Stain E. Remember, these are on stains. This is where he either bled or he vomited, and DNA is found within that. There were 2 contributors on stain E. 1 was John. Then they swabbed the unstained area of John's jeans. They found 4 DNA contributors and only 1 was John's. Now, you could argue all of this in a couple of different ways, such as what I just said. Hey, the DNA was contained in the same area of the stain. Maybe it happened during or after the crime. This must be the perpetrator. Or you could argue, well, he was in a bar and mingling and probably picked up other people's DNA onto his clothing. But you know what you can't argue about these other contributors? You can't say it was Alexis. They got to the shirts. For the orange shirt, a swab from a stain from the top front. The only one there was John's. Same with the bottom right and the top back of that orange shirt. And that makes sense because he had the gray shirt over top of that orange shirt. On the gray shirt, the stain at the top was a single contributor, and that was John. The stain on the back bottom, there were 2 contributors. 1 was John's. On the gray sweatshirt, in an unstained area, they found 2 contributors, and 1 was John's. And the second, there wasn't a sufficient amount for testing. And this surprised me a little bit because I would have expected a lot of other DNA on that outer shirt. So you would expect there to be more DNA. John's right shoe, there were 5 contributors. I would expect other contributors on his outer clothing, but inside his shoe, because of the quality of this sample, it could not be tested. And the reason they say quality is because there are too many contributors for them to be able to test that. And you know what we haven't heard yet. I don't know if we are going to, but we haven't heard about any testing done on his socks for hairs or fibers or DNA or other debris. His gray shirt, the top front, there was not enough DNA for comparison. 2 other areas, including the sleeve of that gray shirt, there was not enough DNA to test. The defense had no questions on cross. And you see how easy that is? You follow procedure and they got nothing to attack you on. I'll leave it here for now. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.